With Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the number of attacks on Winston Churchill, the British World War II Prime Minister and major political figure, actually, for some time, even after the war as well. He held another period of premiership in the early 1950s. Now, the analysis is, or which is an accurate one, by the way, that Churchill was amongst the war group that wanted to go to war with Germany after it invaded Poland in September 1939, and that therefore Churchill bears primary or considerable responsibility for the war. And the war Britain went to war to guarantee the independence of Poland. So now Poland, in modern terms at least, had only been a nation since, the end of World War I. So they've only really been a nation for, not even 20 years. So they're a relatively new nation in modern historical terms. They had been a nation previously, often in combination with like the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, for example. So it had gone through a variety of iterations, but it had been resurrected briefly during Napoleon's period. Sort of the wider, greater Warsaw area was called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and that was sort of like a small rump Polish state, which incidentally Hitler was willing to consider in 1939. But anyway, in 1945 or the end of 1944 and into 1945, Poland was occupied by the Red Army, the Soviet Union communist forces who occupied Poland. So Poland lost its independence anyway. So Britain went to war to guarantee Polish independence, which then was surrendered tamely and meekly without complaint to the Soviets in following World War II, or at the end of World War II. So why did Britain go to war? Poland wasn't independent, so Britain had torn itself to pieces. Millions of lives had been lost for what? For nothing. Nothing was achieved. The original aims of the war to guarantee Polish independence had been fully unsatisfied. So what was the war all about? Now, that's sort of when the propaganda began to click into high. Well, the reason we went to war was to stop Hitler, and that really was the propaganda that the whole thing rested upon. Since now, is it warranted the attacks on Churchill? He was an idiot. He was a bum. He was a warmonger. He was a fool. He was delusional. These. No. Let's get some reality in the conversation here. Were the aims of the war pointless, and did they bankrupt Britain? And did Britain go to war for no purpose or gain or benefit? Well, sure. So that part of it's true. Did Britain end up guaranteeing Poland's independence? Yeah, well, no. So that side of it's true as well. But let's have a look at Churchill's role in all this and the views that he brought to the views and attitudes and considerations that he brought to the table. Now, Churchill wasn't alone. I mean, he was a prominent figure in the government from 1940 onwards, but he wasn't the sole decision maker. There are others that he had to agree if he'd been, if the rest of the cabinet and the war cabinet had disagreed with him and stared him down, they could have done that. So he wasn't a dictator, and he still had to front Parliament and answer questions and so on. So let's just have a look at this. Now, Churchill was born in the 1870s when the British Empire was a great empire. And Churchill was, if anything, a child of the aristocracy, a child of empire. And, Britain's empire was vast all around the world. And Britain was a heavy hitter back in the day. I mean, it was the number one superpower at the time. Now, when Churchill was born, the end of the empire and its greatness and its power was probably at its apex. Within a few years of Churchill being born, say, around 1880. So Churchill would be like $5 or $6 or something. That was the high point. It was going downhill from there. Now the downhill aspect of Britain's power was really in somewhat invisible. And there's a few things that showed it up. Total industrial warfare was something that showed up Britain's weakness. It was no longer a great power on that scale, and the ability to efficiently use, train, marshal, and direct resources at an operational level, Britain was also declining. This could be operational in terms of industrial or say military organisation, social organisation, and so on. So this was the empire. The power of the empire was ebbing away. Industrially, Britain was falling behind, particularly in the newer technologies, electronics, optics, precision engineered steel, so metallurgy. Britain was falling behind, and so on. So quality control in engineering and manufacturing, Britain was falling well behind there as well. So there are a lot of issues in terms of Britain's industrial strength. They also had an economic model that not exclusively, an economic model that meant they would get raw materials from the empire, places like Australia and so on, South Africa and the like. They would get raw materials, they would manufacture it, and then would re-export the finished goods to the empire, around Canada, Australia, and the like. So they could sell a large proportion of them, not all, but a large proportion of the manufactured goods, which were already quite a lower quality, really, than what the Germans and the Americans could produce. The British had an artificial market for that through the empire or the Commonwealth, which was becoming known, or later became known. So the basis for Britain's wealth was already on pretty shaky ground. Now, the basis for American and German wealth, that the two main competitors Britain had at the time, was quality engineered goods, the very best quality in the world, superb quality control, standardized parts, fine engineered steel. Again, a lot of advances in the newer technologies such as electronics. And so, manufacturing at scale, large factories rather than spreads of cottage industry factories that a large part of British industry still relied on. And the Germans were competing and the Americans were competing in world markets with better quality, better priced goods, so that they were winning through just better products, better engineering, better organization, better manufacturing techniques. Whereas the British were operating, not completely, but in a large extent, in closed markets. Also in to the French, here, we'll take your champagne and we'll give you this in return. So their European markets, where they still sold finished goods, by the way, were quid pro quo exchange, not all, but quid pro quo exchanges rather than winning the business through better products and better prices. And this is something that needs to, I think, be recognised, that the British industry was on shaky ground there. Now, German and American industry was protecting itself behind tariff walls. So these big population, quite wealthy, developed countries were developing their engineering product, their finished products, their industrial goods behind tariff, to a large extent, not completely, but behind tariff walls, which gave, in the large populations that both these countries had, which gave then pretty much the domestic market to the local producers. But they used it very effectively to produce quality engineered goods, or quality goods of any type, quality engineered goods, rather than just feather bedding it, which the British industry tended to do. You look at any most places, including the Americans later on in the 1960s and so on, they used tariffs to protect inefficiency. So you be as inefficient as you want, because you can just keep on putting up the prices, because we'll protect you with tariffs and quotas and so on. So this was then used to be as inefficient and to produce low quality goods at a bad, an uncompetitive price, and so on. So Britain was already in that loop, in that cycle. That cycle of decline was already there. To some extent, that was concealed or hidden or minimized because of Britain's huge trade in what's known as invisibles, such as shipping, insurance, and so on, services in effect. and your stock market services and so on. So this to some extent shielded or made it less recognised. Britain was still a very rich, powerful country. Even into the late 1990s, the British fleet, for example, was still the most technologically advanced and substantial in terms of numbers in the world. But between early to mid 1890s and say 1910, that 15 years, that created a huge change. That 15 years was critical. Britain was already a second-rate power at that time. Now, this brings Churchill into his 30s. So when we look at the First World War, the France and Britain that were considered to be, Britain in particular, but France also considered to be leading industrial powers, they still could not match the industrial capacity and capability of Germany at the time. France and Britain combined could not match it. So this just illustrates the extent to which Britain's already fallen behind, and this is seen across the manufactured goods that Britain used for the war, the inability to have interchangeable parts, the British guns and the industrial, war equipment was breaking down at a much faster rate than the German stuff was. German maintenance was much better quality, manufacturing was better quality, German training and organisation and weaponry was better quality, and so on and so on. So in spite of Britain and France combined, they still couldn't, and even though they had much larger industrial base than Germany, France and Britain combined, much larger industrial and a much larger population, they still couldn't beat the Germans. They still needed the American help in 1917. So this is an illustration of just how far. Now, Churchill, again, was a child of empire and perceived the British Empire, and he saw it through rose-coloured glasses. He saw the empire as vastly more powerful, with vastly more resources and vastly more clout than in reality had. Already by 1910, 1912, Britain was a second-rate power in reality. And again, World War I, a total industrial war, the first total industrial war in history, that illustrated clearly Britain's decline. France and Britain combined could not defeat the Germans in World War I. So this is something to consider, that Britain was no longer a great power. Now, Churchill, again, being a child of empire, child of the aristocracy, he saw Britain through rose-coloured glasses, even during the Depression. Now, the Depression, hit a number of countries. The American economy had boomed, and debts were huge. It had gone well beyond itself, and so they felt pain, considerable pain. Vast numbers of labourers running around with a hammer. They had no skills, and they were particularly hard hit. This massive pool of day labourers in effect, and the effect, these people were hit hard, and they made up a huge portion of the workforce in the roaring 1920s. But Britain didn't have that same level of debt and that same proportion of just straight day labourers, so they weren't hit as hard. And even during the 1930s, Britain managed to balance the budget, which was a major accomplishment at the time. Now, they were able to do this because of the empire and the Commonwealth and that sort of stuff. Again, having captive markets that the Americans didn't have, and that the Americans or others, Germans and so on, were locked out of. So when the British government was playing in the international, America had somewhat withdrawn from international, not totally, but somewhat withdrawn from international affairs, which gave Britain an artificial prominence in world affairs. And drunk on this prominence, the British believed they were much heavier hitters and bigger players, and they really were. Again, they'd fallen behind. They were a second-rate power. Now, they could imagine they were heavier hitters than they really were, but it was imaginary. It was, as you could say, delusional. Now, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, this is the guy who signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler, that peace in our time and all that sort of stuff. He's written off as an idiotic, silly little twat, bum who just didn't know what he's doing, weak and so on. That's not true. I mean, he was no weak idiot. He didn't. Britain wasn't ready to go for war. Britain didn't want war, and and Chamberlain was attempting to say, okay, to Hitler, what else do you want? Can we call it a day? You've got Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten land in Czechoslovakia. Do you have any other territorial requirements in Europe? Now, everybody knew that the Polish corridor, which divided, this is from the Versailles Treaty, the Polish corridor divided East Germany from Germany. Everybody knew that Polish corridor was a bone of contention. And everybody knew that Hitler and the German government was going to seek some sort of resolution to that, whether through negotiation or other means. But it was obviously going to. So Chamberlain's thing that this is peace in our time, the Germans have no more territorial claims. Everybody knew that was bullshit. But Chamberlain had nailed Hitler down to say, okay, any more claims you make on European territory will trigger war, or is likely to trigger war, and then Britain gave very public guarantees to Poland of its independence, which was telling Hitler, you do anything about, you invade Poland or try to take any Polish territory, then it could lead to war. So this was very clearly mapped out. So Chamberlain had put Hitler into a position where if Hitler did act on the Polish corridor, which he was obviously going to, and everybody knew that he or any German government would have, then it was going to result in some sort of confrontation, which indeed it did. Now, Churchill wasn't Prime Minister at the time, so to sheet home the blame for the declaration of war to Churchill is a stretch. Was Churchill warning about the rise of Germany and its territorial ambitions? Well, he was, and he had, and he was one of the prime movers in the British government, at least, of making these concerns known. But he wasn't the only one, and again, he wasn't the Prime Minister when war was declared on September 3rd, 1939, over Hitler's invasion of Poland. Now, just going back a bit, Hitler invited the Polish government to negotiate over the Polish corridor. The Polish government told him to get lost, and so war became, the primary option of dealing with the corridor. The Poles could have negotiated something, but they didn't. And assuming again, if you look at the Polish sort of writings at the time, they again thought Britain was this huge, mighty power that would just crush Germany with a wave of their hand. And the Poles had this very unrealistic, delusional view of British power. And we're protected by mighty Britain. No one dare do anything. And this was again quite delusional. Britain just didn't. The people who were looking at the real politic of the time, Britain was in no position to start or prosecute or fight a war, and that should have been clear to most onlookers. It was really the bluster, the threat of war, and the threat of the British Navy blockading, that sort of stuff, which is pretty much all Britain had at the time. So the British were hoping that the declaration of war in itself would be enough to stop Germany. Now, Hitler was open to creating, as Napoleon had, a Grand Duchy of Warsaw type, Polish Warsaw type rump state. He was open to that, and if the British had negotiated, then Hitler would have got his East Germany back integrated with Germany, which was what he wanted to do, and the German government generally wanted to do. And would Poland have lost some territory, and would it have been? Yes, it would have, but that would have been better than having no state at all. So now, at that point, that was the end of Hitler's territorial ambition, aside from eradicating communism, which was the Bolshevism, communism, that is the Soviet Union. So Hitler My take is that if the British government had negotiated a Warsaw, type rump state, which had allowed Germany to integrate with East Germany to integrate with the main part of Germany, then that would have been the end of it, and war could have been averted. But the British rejected that any sort of discussion. Only absolute withdrawal from Poland was acceptable, and therefore it was war. And so now Churchill was part of the crowd that was clamouring for war. Maybe he's a little bit of a stretch, but his view of the empire was the rose-coloured glasses of the era in which he was born. The reality is Churchill could never in reality, and was delusional, I think, in this sense, could never in reality accept that Britain no longer had the power or the resources or the military capability or industrial capability, for that matter, no longer had the capability to play at the top tier. The British public similarly had no interest in war. They had a small cadre of soldiers that were professionals and were good at prosecuting warfare. The average citizen wanted nothing to do with it. And this comes across in Britain's military performance in World War II, which was beyond pathetic. So Churchill was again rose-coloured glasses over the empire. He remembered the empire of the 1880s, 1890s, when he was, boy at school, or a young man, or a journalist running around the place in South Africa and India and so on, looking for action, looking for daring do escapades and so on. That was the empire that Churchill remembered. And even into the 1940s, his during World War II, some of his military advisors would try and hide maps of Europe from him, because as soon as he would see a map of Europe, so the commentary goes, he would imagine that Britain, mighty Britain, would its resources, unlimited and endless and potent, would just simply land on the continent, slap around the Germans, kick ass left, right, and centre, and would liberate everything and be great heroes. The days of Lord Marlborough and the Duke of Wellington and this sort of, those, remembering those sort of, conjuring up those images of a Britain that was infinitely more powerful on a relative basis back in the day than it was then. Britain, in fact, was barely able to survive. Wasn't able to survive. In fact, without American aid, Britain wouldn't have survived. Now, part of Churchill's prosecuting of the war, particularly after the collapse of the British and French armies in France in 1940, Churchill's whole position was a gambit. Everything was risked on the hope. And the dice throw, the crapshoot that America would enter the war, and that America's population and industrial capacity would swing it in Britain's favour, and that was the whole thing. That was it. That was Churchill's war plan. The reality was Britain just did not have the military resources, or even close, or the military competence. The British Army was nowhere near the standard of the German Wehrmacht. And this was shown time and time again, whether it was in France, whether it was in the campaigns in Norway, campaigns in North Africa. It didn't matter. The British just weren't in that category. And again, the industrial resources that Britain had weren't anywhere near enough to match what the Germans could put together. So Churchill's gambit was that the Americans would enter the war. Now, what were Churchill's failings? Churchill was a great wartime leader. He rallied the people. He made inspiring speeches. He toured, the areas, and a lot of people, particularly the military top brass in Britain, just couldn't understand why. General Allenbrook is a case in point. Couldn't understand why Churchill was so popular. He just had a way of inspiring the people, and again his speeches and so on. When you see Churchill just speaking off the cuff during World War II without prepared speeches, and we will fight on the landing grounds and the beaches, all that sort of stirring stuff. When you look at his off the cuff unscripted speeches, they're not very impressive. He often can pop out a one-liner here and there, but not beyond that. And Churchill was pretty good for one-liners. From time to time. One I always liked was there was this female politician in Parliament that used to try and pester Churchill, and she said one day, if you were my husband, I'd put poison in your tea. And Churchill responded, if you were my wife, I'd drink it. I always loved that one. But Churchill was an inspiring wartime leader. I remember talking to people who were children, during the height of the war, World War II, the bombing and the Blitz and this, that, and the next thing. And they recall everybody would listen to the, Mr. Churchill, Prime Minister, is making an announcement, and this was all very ooh. And so people would gather around the radio, or the wireless set as they call, and would listen. His speeches were very comforting. He was like this big father figure who was telling everyone that everything's going to be all right. We're in control here. We know what we're doing, and this was very reassuring to a lot of people who were thinking that times weren't so good, which they weren't. British armed forces were being defeated left, right, and centre by the Germans and by the Japanese, and shameful surrenders such as Singapore and Tobruk and so on. So the British were buoyed, their spirits were buoyed by Churchill. Was Churchill a great wartime leader in practical military terms? Sure, the inspiring speeches and all this sort of thing. Churchill could get things done, and he was an energetic sort of guy. He would just get on the phone and say, hey, get off your ass and do this and that. He was often pushing the armed services, groups of armed services, to go into action before they're ready. And this resulted in a number of serious mistakes, oversights, and fiascos even. And Churchill's demand, I want action. And they would say, well, look, we've only got a small amount of equipment, and the men haven't been trained, and don't care, action. And this led to, now Churchill would see that as an inspiring war leader that was kicking ass and getting things done. Reality was it led to far more mistakes and again fiascos than anything else, and the achievements of his prodding and pushing and hectoring and pestering were minimal, if any. There were instances where it was worthwhile or where it was helpful. For example, a section of the armed services, look, we need more resources because we need to do this and that, and I'm having a hard time getting it from. So Church would be on the phone, hey, get the resources over here and get it done now. And so that was a positive thing. And that's a bit harder to quantify. And he did that many times. And I'm sure that resulted in delayed, not instant action stuff, but positive outcomes. In terms of Churchill's involvement, though, in the actual military decision-making, I see that as a bit of a disaster. His rose-coloured glasses view of horrendously underestimating the enemy capacity and equally overestimating to a very large extent Britain's capacity at a military industrial level was constant and ongoing, and that I think caused many problems in the war that otherwise could have been avoided. The reality of the British part, if you look at the British military machine, it was so far behind the Wehrmacht, German capacity and Japanese capacity at the time. One of the key areas was not necessarily just equipment or organisation, although that was it, or the quality of the generalship, or again, that was a factor, but rather in the motivation of the soldiers. you look at the motivation of the German and the Japanese soldiers, as much as you might write them off as fanatics or something like that, their motivation and their determination and skills and quality of training, leadership and direction, anticipate, just the commitment of the whole edifice was far greater than the British was. Far greater. The British look like absolute amateurs compared to the Germans and the Japanese, as in beginners. That they look like they just come out of some half-assed bullshit training school. But the Japanese capacity for jungle ambushes, for example, even years into the war, when the Japanese have shown how good they were at this, still the British couldn't seem to deal with it or match it or find ways around it. And the attempts that were made again were so amateurish, and this is intriguing. This intrigues me to a large extent. Of not only were the British far behind the quality of the Japanese and German armed forces at the beginning of the war, they barely seem to improve over the time, and this is astonishing as well. So coming back to the Churchill thing, is he to blame? Well, as it turned out that the Soviet Union, that was a vital ally to defeating Hitler, without their involvement, Hitler could not have been defeated. And if Hitler had succeeded in defeating the Red Army, which came within a whisker of succeeding, by the way, to defeated the Red Army in 1941, then Britain's position would have been hopeless. They'd have had to cut a deal with Germany, and Hitler was prepared, certainly in the earlier stages at least, to be beyond magnanimous to Britain. Say, look, give us a free hand in Europe and Eastern Europe, and you can have your empire. We don't need to bother with you. You can have, and more than anything, Hitler wanted to be treated as an equal to what he perceived to be, the great men of the time, such as British prime ministers. And if they'd sort of fated him as a great leader and a great man and so on, he would have been so chuffed. I think he'd have given the British whatever they wanted, pretty much. So I don't think the attacks on Churchill are warranted. I think he was delusional in the sense that he imagined Britain was still a great power when it wasn't, and therefore the attitudes and views he expressed were related to that. Had he not thought Britain was a great empire, then he may not have been the inspiring speech-making, wartime leader that he was. But the victories that he delivered were quite hollow. Okay, they stopped Germany, but instead they got Stalin. Somebody tell me how that's an improvement. It's hard to see. So I don't think the attacks against Churchill are warranted. He still is a great wartime leader, but was he the right man for that time? Probably not. His belief in the empire is what kept him going. The belief in the greatness of Britain is what kept him going. If he hadn't had that belief, and few others around him did, by the way, if he hadn't had that belief, then he may not even have existed or reached that position or been chosen by the British government at the time to be the Prime Minister. So that's my view on this. You've been on Tassos today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.